There is a specific, suffocating brand of misery that only occurs during a British heatwave. Because the country spends 11 months of the year huddled under a blanket of damp gray drizzle, its infrastructure is utterly defenseless when the sun decides to launch a blistering 34-degree assault. Buildings become greenhouses, asphalt turns to sticky black licorice, and if you happen to work in a poorly ventilated, tin-roofed hardware shop, you aren't just an employee anymore, you are a slow-roasting piece of meat. But the worst part of surviving a retail heatwave isn't the sweat stinging your eyes or the smell of melting rubber and hot fertilizer. The worst part is knowing that the person in charge of your suffering is sitting comfortably in a refrigerated fortress, utterly indifferent to your plight. This is the story of how a seemingly insignificant desk fan ignited a mutiny, and how a momentary act of sabotage evolved into a daily, years-long psychological war against a boss who thought he was untouchable. The air inside Farnaby's hardware and timber was thick enough to chew. It was the second Saturday of July, and the temperature had already shattered local records by noon. Down on the shop floor, the atmosphere was a toxic stew of trapped heat, airborne sawdust, and the pungent, chemical tang of industrial weed killer baking on the shelves. Bram stood behind the main till a damp rag draped over the back of his neck, watching a bead of sweat carve a jagged path through the dust on the countertop. Beside him was Tamsin, the floor supervisor. Tamsin was a fiercely competent woman who usually moved through the store with the terrifying efficiency of a hunting falcon. Today, however, she was slumped against the key-cutting machine, her uniform polo shirt plastered to her spine, fanning her flushed face with a laminated display sign for brass hinges. The shop's centralized air conditioning unit, a massive industrial beast mounted on the roof, sat completely dormant. The control panel for it was locked securely inside the manager's office on the second floor. "I'm going to melt into a puddle of flesh and name tags," Tamsin muttered, her voice entirely devoid of its usual sharp edge. "If I pass out, drag my body into the paint mixer. It's what I would have wanted." "I've called upstairs 3 times, Bram replied, wiping his forehead with the back of a grimy hand. "He keeps saying the same thing. It's not that hot, stop being dramatic." "I swear to God, Tamsin, the display candles in aisle 4 are actually drooping." The he in question was Vernon. Vernon was the branch manager, a man whose entire personality could be summed up by a clip-on tie and a profound, sneering contempt for anyone who earned an hourly wage. Vernon didn't do heavy lifting. Vernon didn't deal with the general public. Vernon spent his days secluded in his upstairs office, playing God with spreadsheets and pretending he was the CEO of a multinational conglomerate rather than the manager of a mid-sized suburban hardware supplier. A customer approached the till, an elderly man clutching a box of wood screws. His face was the color of a boiled lobster, and he was violently dabbing at his temples with a crumpled handkerchief. "Christ almighty, lad," the old man wheezed, sliding the screws across the counter. "Are you trying to bake us alive in here? It's hotter than the devil's armpit. Turn the bloody cooling on before someone drops dead." "I'm incredibly sorry, sir," Bram said, forcing a tight, highly rehearsed customer service smile. "Our manager is currently assessing the climate situation. We hope to have the system engaged shortly." The man grumbled, paid in damp coins, and shuffled out the automatic doors, which offered a brief, agonizingly short gasp of moving air before sliding shut again. Bram slammed the till drawer closed. The metallic clack echoed in the stifling quiet of the empty store. "That's it. That's the 5th complaint in an hour. I'm going up there. I don't care if he fires me. I'm going to physically press the button on the wall myself." Tamsin didn't try to stop him. She merely offered a solemn, exhausted nod. "Godspeed, Bram. Avenge us." Bram marched toward the back of the store, his steel-toed boots feeling like lead weights. He climbed the narrow metal staircase leading to the managerial suite. With every step he took, he noticed a distinct, localized shift in the atmosphere. By the time he reached the landing, the oppressive, dusty heat of the shop floor had faded, replaced by a crisp, beautiful chill. He knocked once on the frosted glass door and pushed it open without waiting for an answer. The contrast was violently offensive. Vernon's office was an oasis of perfect, regulated comfort. The blinds were drawn to block the harsh sun. Vernon himself was reclined in a plush, faux-leather ergonomic chair, scrolling idly through his phone. But the absolute worst detail, the thing that made Bram's jaw clench so hard his teeth ached, was sitting directly on the edge of Vernon's pristine mahogany desk. It was a premium, oscillating tower fan, purring softly as it swept a continuous, glorious breeze directly over Vernon's unsweating, perfectly dry face. Vernon didn't even look up from his phone. I thought I told you to stop ringing the intercom, Bram. The thermostat stays where it is. Corporate wants us cutting overheads this quarter. It's barely 25 degrees outside. It's 34 outside, Vernon, Bram said, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. It's closer to 40 on the floor. The roof is corrugated tin. The customers are complaining. Tamsin looks like she's about to go into cardiac arrest. You need to turn the central air on. Now, Vernon finally looked up, offering a patronizing sigh. He reached out, casually adjusting the angle of his desk fan so the breeze hit his neck just right. You floor staff are so incredibly fragile. Drink some tap water. Open the loading bay doors at the back if you need a draft. I am trying to balance the payroll, and I cannot concentrate with you whining about a bit of summer weather. Back to the floor, Bram. Now, Bram stood there for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at Vernon. He looked at the fan. He looked at the locked plastic box encasing the AC controls on the wall. A dark, jagged little seed took root in Bram's chest. He didn't argue, he didn't shout. He simply turned around, stepped out of the icy sanctuary, and descended back into the inferno. When he reached the till, Tamsin looked at him expectantly. Well, he has a fan, Bram said. The words tasted like ash. A lovely, high-powered, oscillating desk fan pointed right at his smug face. He said we should drink tap water. Tamsin's eyes, previously glazed with heat exhaustion, suddenly snapped into sharp focus. The lethargy vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating gleam. He takes his lunch at exactly 1 o'clock, she murmured, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He goes to the pub down the street for a pint and a sandwich. He leaves the office unlocked because he thinks we're too stupid to figure out the handle. Bram looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was 12:45. And the central air controls, locked behind a Perspex case. Needs a barrel key, Tamsin replied. But the fan is a free agent. For the next 15 minutes they worked in absolute tense silence. At precisely 1 o'clock, they heard the heavy thud of the upstairs door closing, followed by the clatter of Vernon's Oxfords descending the stairs. They watched from behind a towering display of power drills as Vernon strolled out the front entrance, whistling a tuneless melody, entirely unbothered by the wall of heat that greeted him. The moment the automatic doors slid shut, Tamsin bolted for the stairs. Bram was right behind her. They practically flew up the metal steps. Tamsin grabbed the handle of the office door, twisted and pushed. It opened with a soft click. The room was empty. The tower fan was still running, sweeping back and forth like a sentry. Without a word, Bram marched forward, yanked the plug from the wall socket, and scooped the machine into his arms. It felt heavy, substantial, and incredibly illicit. They hurried back down the stairs, bypassing the shop floor entirely, and slipped through the heavy double doors leading to the rear stockroom. The stockroom was a cavernous, dimly lit space filled with towering pallets of cement and heavy timber. It was completely soundproof from the main floor. Bram set the fan down in the center of the concrete aisle. He looked at Tamsin. She looked at him. There was an unspoken, primal understanding passing between them. "Do you want the honors or should I?" Bram asked. Tamsin took a step back, gesturing grandly with one hand. "You made the trek upstairs. You take the first shot." Bram didn't hesitate. He raised his right leg and brought his heavy, steel-toed work boot down directly onto the plastic casing of the tower fan. The sound was spectacular, a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the high corrugated ceilings. The plastic housing shattered, exposing the motorized guts and the long, cylindrical blades inside. But one stomp wasn't enough to purge the rage of a 6-hour heat wave. Tamsin stepped in, driving the heel of her boot into the control panel, crushing the speed dials into a mess of splintered plastic and copper wire. They took turns, a silent, frantic dance of destruction, stomping and kicking until the pristine cooling machine was reduced to an unrecognizable pile of jagged shrapnel and bent metal. Breathing heavily, sweat pouring down their faces, they stood over the wreckage. "Bin bag," Tamsin gasped. Bram grabbed a heavy-duty contractor bag from a nearby open box. They swept the remains of the fan into the black plastic, tied it off with a tight double knot, and hauled it out the back fire exit. They didn't put it in the store's dumpster. That was too risky. Instead, they marched it 2 blocks down the alleyway and unceremoniously shoved it into an overflowing public council bin, burying it beneath a pile of discarded takeaway containers. By the time they returned to the shop floor, their alibis were airtight. When Vernon walked back through the front doors at 2 o'clock, smelling faintly of stale beer and vinegar crisps, Bram was calmly restocking sandpaper, and Tamsin was pretending to audit the till. Vernon didn't even look at them as he headed upstairs. 10 minutes passed. Then they heard it, the heavy, frantic thud of footsteps on the ceiling. Vernon came flying down the stairs, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. He marched up to the till, his eyes darting frantically around the shop. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice pitching up an octave. "Where is what, Vernon?" Tamsin asked, blinking with wide, innocent eyes. "My fan. Someone has been in my office and stolen my desk fan." "We've been down here the whole time," Bram said smoothly. "We haven't seen anyone go up there. Did you leave the door unlocked?" Vernon's face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. He couldn't admit to leaving the door unsecured, as that was a direct violation of company protocol. I must have misplaced it, or someone snuck in while you two were dawdling down here." He spent the next 2 hours tearing the store apart. He checked the staff break room, he checked the bathrooms, he even dug through the reduced-to-clear bin in aisle 3. He practically interrogated a teenage customer who had come in to buy a light bulb. But as the afternoon wore on, the adrenaline of his frantic search began to fade, and the brutal reality of the shop's climate finally set in. With his office now a stagnant, stifling box, Vernon was forced to spend the final hour of his shift pacing the shop floor, trying to micromanage Bram and Tamsin to distract himself from the heat. Within 20 minutes, the back of his crisp blue shirt was saturated with sweat. His face, usually pale and smug, was slick and red. He looked miserable. He looked defeated. At exactly 4:45, Vernon stopped pacing. He leaned heavily against an end cap of WD-40, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, and wiped his face. He looked at Bram, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. It is a bit warm down here, isn't it?" Vernon muttered. Bram smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of the lips. "We hadn't noticed, Vernon. We've just been drinking tap water." Vernon didn't reply. He unclipped his key lanyard, turned around, and trudged slowly up the stairs. 2 minutes later, a deep, rumbling vibration echoed through the ceiling. The massive vents above the aisles clattered open, and a glorious, rushing torrent of ice-cold air blasted down onto the shop floor. Tamsin closed her eyes and tilted her head back, letting the freezing breeze wash over her. It was the sweetest victory they had ever tasted. But retail workers have long memories, and a single afternoon of poetic justice wasn't enough to balance the scales. The AC incident had proven something vital. Vernon was vulnerable, and he was deeply, fundamentally lazy. He drove a pristine, silver mid-tier executive saloon, which he parked in a designated, highly coveted spot right by the back door of the stockroom. He liked that spot because it meant he only had to walk 10 feet to get inside. The morning after the fan incident, Bram and Tamsin arrived for their opening shift at 6 a.m. The air was cool, the sun barely up. They walked around to the back alley and stared at the massive, 1,100-liter industrial waste bin that sat against the brick wall. It was mounted on heavy rubber casters and weighed a staggering amount when full. Wordlessly, they both grabbed the handles. They heaved, dragging the massive plastic beast away from the wall and rolling it perfectly into the dead center of Vernon's parking space. An hour later, Vernon's silver car pulled into the alley. Bram and Tamsin watched through the tiny, wire mesh window of the stockroom door. Vernon stopped his car. He honked his horn, expecting someone to come rushing out. Nobody did. After a minute of agonizing delay, Vernon put the car in park, opened his door, and stepped out into the damp morning air. He was wearing a fresh suit. He had to grab the filthy, grease-stained handles of the industrial bin and strain with all his might to push it out of his way, his polished shoes slipping on the wet tarmac. By the time he managed to clear the spot, he was out of breath, his hands were black with grime, and his suit jacket was visibly rumpled. Bram and Tamsin high-fived in the shadows. It became a religion. Every single morning, without fail, they moved the bin. It didn't matter if it was raining. It didn't matter if it was snowing. It didn't matter if the wind was howling off the coast. Every morning, Vernon arrived to find a towering monument of garbage blocking his designated sanctuary. Every morning, he had to stop his car, get out into the elements, and physically wrestle with a filthy plastic box before he could start his day. He tried complaining to them, demanding to know who was leaving the bin there. They simply shrugged, blaming the midnight refuse collectors, blaming the wind, blaming local teenagers. Because there were no cameras in the back alley, Vernon could never prove a thing. They kept it up for 3.5 years. Over 1,000 mornings of petty, beautiful friction. Over 1,000 times, Vernon had to dirty his hands and ruin his morning routine, entirely unaware that he was paying a daily, compounding tax for the crime of letting his people sweat while he sat in the cool breeze. There is a profound lesson hidden in the shattered plastic of a stolen desk fan. Leadership is not about possessing the keys to the thermostat. It is about recognizing the shared humanity of the people keeping your walls standing. When those in power choose the comfort of their bubble over the well-being of the people doing the heavy lifting, they sever the unspoken contract of respect. And when respect is gone, all that remains is the cold, calculated arithmetic of consequence. Empathy isn't just a moral imperative. It is the only thing standing between a comfortable office and a daily battle with an industrial dumpster in the freezing rain. If you enjoyed this story of justified workplace retribution, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. And if you've ever had to enact your own petty vengeance against a tyrannical boss, drop your story in the comments below, because the best revenge is the one we share.